Now, we got progression through the lifespan. We talked about the genetic differences, sex male XY, sex female XX, and then all of the other stuff besides reproduction that's put on top of that. Well, it does matter. It does cause differences in social constructs that then are our lives, and those things are the conditions we work with. And they're changing, and that's good, because it's not a patriarchal dominated society in our country anymore, although there's still tendencies toward that, right? You still see gaps and things of that in pay. You still see things where now you have to have a commercial that says girls can do things. Why? To give the message that they actually can do the things, so they're more likely to try the things, succeed in the things, and confirm that they can do the things that biologically, mentally, or cognitively, and emotionally, they were really inherently capable of anyway. But we all go through this period assuming that we have the genetic propensity. You can have some anomalies like XXY chromosomes and things like that. You can have some chromosomal damage or some hormonal problems that create intersex conditions physically. But for the vast majority of people, what happens is they are type female or type male. They approach puberty, going through this period of prepubescence and then pubescence. And what you have is a triggering of a cascading of hormones that then activates the structures that will become reproductively viable to create progeneration of the species, make that a possibility. And androgens is the main class of male hormones triggered by the presence of the Y chromosome and the cascading effects that come from that. And estrogens are the main class of female hormones. But I told you before, it's kind of default female. Everybody's wired that way unless you have the Y chromosome to activate development of male. Then you get what is essentially phenotypical female, even if they're actually genotypically male. Right? You have to have the hormones triggered to start the process of degenerating the Mullerian system and the promotion of the Wolffian system, which differentiates us biologically into male and female to have sexual reproduction in the biological sense. But everybody's got androgens and everybody's got estrogens. We all have them. It's the relative proportion of them that creates the cascade that brings us about to sexual maturity in a biological sense, not in a psychological sense. But we look at the primary characteristics, and they're different for males and they're different for females, although there's some shared variance here. But we're talking about primary sex characteristics being related directly to reproductive capacity. Okay, that's, for me, the thing that makes it easiest on the test to distinguish. You need to have these differences to be reproductively viable. In other words, sterility would come from not having primary sex characteristics, which are, for the female, the ovaries, obviously vagina and uterus, where the implanted egg would then develop into the embryo and fetus. And for the males, we're talking about the testes and, of course, the actual penis itself, which would deliver the semen, etc. So you're talking about sperm and egg, where those are, follicles, testes, and they're the delivery then to be fertilized. So that's, for females, when you are aware that as a female you are first potentially able to become pregnant, would theoretically be at the first menstruation, because that means you've gone through ovulation once, right? So the eggs that you were born with are now maturing, and they're being released theoretically one at a time, although there's some anomalies with that. Individuals vary. You might have two released. That's how you get dizygotic twins, two eggs, two different sperm developing at the same time, and they share 50% of their genetic material. Menarche, psychologically, I would think could be devastating, and I know that that's the case for some people who aren't properly oriented, people being women, to that coming on. A lot of times, especially in olden times, girls weren't taught about that. They discovered it in a rather horrific fashion that it occurred, and then they were told how to deal with it. So if you got girls, talk to them about that, because that's pretty dramatic to have that occurrence happen to you. I don't know what it's like, so as I say, is there anything I can do for somebody going through that, is what I would say as a partner, not, why are you acting all like that? Because I don't have to go through the hormonal changes, and I don't have to go through the menses, and I don't have to go through the headaches, and I don't have to do it for decades on end, and I don't have to get pregnant, and I don't have to bear the kids. But males have some similar thing. When they're ready to be able, a little kid can have an erection, a little male kid could have an erection, but they're not sexually viable at that point, right? That's something that Freud would talk to later. It's not sex in the way that we think about it as adults, right? But then spermarchy, which would be essentially a wet dream, would be the nocturnal emission, meaning that they became aroused at night and are able to ejaculate sperm. So you have to have a fertilizable egg released, and you have to have a sperm ejaculation to fertilize the egg. So that is primary sex characteristics. Secondary, really, is all that other stuff we kind of really associate with being boys and girls. These are the more overt, observable characteristics that come with being male or female. So that now we're talking about sex-specific physical features that develop. So for women, breasts tend to get bigger because that's where the adipose tissue is, and that's the mammary glands, and that's where you're going to provide lactation, right, to an infant. That's developing breast milk and being able to feed. Pubic hair happens for both males and females. So the development of pubic hair in the genital regions, under arms. Voices change for men and female, but much more dramatic change for males, right? They go from talking like this to talking like this in real quick time, it seems like. They develop that deeper larynx. But facial hair, men tend to get it more than women, but women can get facial hair, all right? And men don't always get a lot of it. I don't grow a beard because it looks ridiculous, because they don't come in that thick, right? So you have all kinds of individual variations in all of these secondary characteristics. And then muscles and fat. Men tend to develop more muscle. When you're looking at fat to muscle ratios, women develop more fat, and that's because they are the ones who bear the children. In fact, for people who are anorexic, women who are anorexic, somehow the body realizes that there's a percent body fat below which it is not viable to sustain a pregnancy, and it will cease menstruation. Right? That's pretty dramatic if you think about it. The body recognizes that the physical material needed to sustain another organism growing inside oneself are not present, so it stops the process of fertilizing eggs until body fat is back up to minimal standards to allow that to occur. So the body's a pretty amazing little device on males and females, but you see that we don't really have a whole lot of differences outside of the different biological roles we play in progenerating our species. The rest of this comes around from gender roles. What do girls do? What do boys do? That happens to have a lot to do with what societies expect of them, and cultures vary across the world, and they vary across time. In our culture 100 years ago, women's roles were set very rigidly, and everybody thought that was just biologically or biblically the way it was. That's just how it is. That is not to be questioned and not to be challenged. Here 100 years later, we look at the revolutions in social change, right? Women's liberation, civil rights, all kinds of ideas that people could be empowered to do all kinds of things regardless of their biological sex. And as that changes, you see people get really uptight about it. Some people don't like that, and other people are much more open about these kinds of changes. Y'all saw Tom Cruise talking about being in love on Oprah Winfrey? Jumping up and down because he was all happy he was in love. And a bunch of people are like, that ain't manly. That ain't cool. Why? He can't be happy and in love? Right? Because men what? Don't have gender roles that encourage expression of all kinds of emotions. Guys get really too. You can either be pissed off or, all right. Those are the safest male emotions you can express in our social order as it is now. Could males be jealous? Of course they are. They just don't show it, and they show it as what? Pissed off. Could they be sad? Of course they are. But what do? Show it as being frustrated and pissed off, right? Could they be fearful? Well, of course they are. But they what? Show it as, I don't care. Right? So expression of emotions varies by social reinforcement. Not because there's some kind of major biological difference that forces males to be stoic, tough, macho, and girls to be soft and sweet and nurturing. Those are what we've expected of those roles for eons, potentially. And because we expect them, we get them. And with adolescence, you know, people are like, man, that's a tumultuous experience. Well, compared to what? Life is a tumultuous experience. My wife's grandfather is in the hospital right now. They're checking him out. I think he's going to be okay. He's 92 years old. 92 is tumultuous, you know? Getting in a relationship in your early life can be tumultuous, right? Getting a job or getting fired can be tumultuous. All kinds of life events can happen to us that are hard to deal with. Adolescence is really a transitional period that is dramatic because we go from being children to adults in a relatively short order, and all kinds of expectations change for us as a result of that. But a few hundred years ago, adolescence didn't exist as a period. Right? When you're in an agricultural-based society, you don't get to go through your teen time. You go to work. Right? If you have the capacity to milk a cow at 5 or 6 years old, go milk the cow, right? You were expected to adopt adult roles because you had to survive. You didn't have a lot of time to play and a lot of stuff like that. If you look back through the history of art, for example, and you look back in the Middle Ages, you see children rendered as little small adults. Right? They're dressed as adults. They are posed as adults. They're not running around playing games. They're supposed to be seen but not heard. And there's all kinds of rigid rules. And if you didn't adhere to them, they would beat you with a stick, which tends to get you the kind of behavior you're looking for, but with some negative side effects. And we'll talk about that in parenting and stuff, right? You can beat somebody into doing something. We didn't have a lot of problems in school, but we didn't even have school at all until we shifted into a, what? Industrialized society. There were some schools because in our history in this country, people thought it was important to learn how to read the Bible because it had a dominant Protestant heritage, which meant you had to be literate, right? But after learning to read, you really don't need any more schooling than that, which is why 8th grade was kind of the peak. But then when you move to an industrial society and kids start taking over jobs that adults need to support their family, then you get things like child labor laws to exclude them from the workforce, not because that's the beneficial thing to do and we're all high-minded. Ultimately, you live with that long enough and you go, well, children just shouldn't work. They shouldn't have to work, right? But then you were dealing with that transition where you had kids who were in an agricultural society and kids in an industrial society. And what happens in the summer in the agricultural society is we need you to work, which means summer vacation comes about. And summer vacation ain't a vacation if you lived on the farm, right? Those kids were getting up in the morning, doing their chores, going to school, learning their reading, writing, arithmetic, then going home and doing their chores. And on summer vacation, they went to work. So the other kids in the cities who had parents who worked in factories and other kinds of jobs, they had the time off, but then you had to figure out ways to keep them off the street because they weren't supervised because their parents were working. So it's very easy to look at other countries now who don't have the same kind of development and go, they shouldn't engage in child labor. But then you look back at our history and go, oh yeah, we did that. Oh, they should have compulsory school for everybody all the way through 12th grade and then make available higher education. Oh yeah, we didn't do that either. So once somebody develops the capacity to do something, it's very easy to look back and go, oh, that's the way it's supposed to be for everybody. But you see the changing roles change possibilities. And changing possibilities is important, especially in psychology.